Hi guys, thanks for tuning into another episode of Nuggets News. Today we've got Robbie Barwick, a returning guest on from the Australian Citizens Party, and I want to have him on to talk about these domestic terrorism laws and how this landscape's all changing. And Robbie's been across this for 20 years, and one thing I've been talking about is ever since 9/11, we've been having this build up towards what is happening now, where they're going to label dissenters and people that have got anti-government views or whatever as domestic terrorists, and with all these free speech laws and this crackdown. So welcome to the show, Robbie.
Thanks, Alex. Good to see you again.
And I wanted you to kind of run people through some of these laws, not just the ones that have passed recently, but some of the ones that were passed decades ago that are going to become more meaningful with the way things are going for people. So yeah, I'll give you the floor.
Well, look, I hope people are suitably shocked at what happened in late January in Parliament, because the bill that was justifiably controversial, and so controversial it actually broke the coalition. That's the reason the coalition split, because they split on this bill, which was the bill to ban hate groups, is one, extraordinarily broad and draconian and totalitarian, but two, it was rammed through in a day. Now, they had another bill that was a bigger bill. They called it an omnibus bill that had three parts to it: one guns, one hate speech, and one hate groups. The hates they tried to push that through in a week, which is still ridiculous. But then the whole of Parliament balked at that, and the hate speech part had to be dropped. They split what was left up into the guns part, which the Greens were more than happy to support, and the hate groups part. The guns part is, I know gun owners are of course going to be very upset about that, because they always see themselves as being lawful people getting punished for the actions of unlawful people. But that's like a similarity to what you're getting around Australia anyway. But the hate groups part is just one of those bills that shreds all principles of civil liberties and rule of law, right? Because essentially this is a law now where groups can be banned, and members, which is an undefined term, so it doesn't need to be someone who's a paid up member of a group, right, with the membership ticket. Just a broad category of members of that group can be jailed, even if that group hasn't committed a crime, and it's retrospective based on things that they label them for doing years earlier, right? And the only safeguard is it requires ASIO advice to do it, but that's assuming that ASIO is somehow a protector of our civil liberties, and I'm about to show you how it's not.
Yeah.
And when I think they made a really bad strategic error on their part, Alex, because in trying to push this bill through essentially in a day, from when it was finalised in writing to when it was voted on, one day, 24 hours, in trying to do that, they shocked the country, and even parties that had never paid any attention or objected to these kinds of laws before, such as the National Party. And now you got a lot of attention on that, and even the media, which has been supremely pathetic over the years in monitoring these kinds of laws. You had David Spears on 7:30 that night asking the Attorney General, "What are these laws akin to authoritarian countries?" And she didn't answer no. Instead, she went on this spiel about justifying how they've got to keep people safe. Right, so the short answer was yes, and then when he got specific and used it as a scenario, could groups that accuse Israel of genocide be banned under this power? Took her a bit to be honest, but then eventually she said yes. Mm-hmm. Right, that's where we're at with these laws. But what we're trying to get people to understand is this is the tip of a 23-year iceberg since 9/11, mm-hmm. and there's well over 100 laws that preceded this that are equally bad. And now the government has another law that they want to get through, which will add to that and is just as bad as this law. And if we're given the reaction to what was rammed through in January, maybe we can get some attention on this ASIO law and be able to stop it.
Yeah, so as you said, since 9/11 in the US was the Patriot Act, but talk us through what Australia did in those following years and how that's going to come into play now.
All right, so the bill I'm referring to now is called the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation Amendment Bill number 2. And it's an amendment of a bill that originally passed in 2003. Because what happened was, America announced the Patriot Act in 2002. John Howard here unveiled 7 bills, which was his government's suite of anti-terrorism bills. And they're worth understanding. Now, the reason I know this subject so well is the Citizens Party was on the front line of fighting those bills then. We actually led the public backlash to those bills, and we had quite an impact at the time. So the 7 bills, I want to highlight the 3 sort of headline ones. The first one was a bill that defined terrorism as a crime. Now, that was actually quite controversial for the simple fact that all acts of terrorism involve existing crimes, right? Murder, arson, whatever. They're all crimes. Why do you need a special crime of terrorism? Well, because they wanted a special definition of terrorism. And the original one that was in the original version of the bill was so broad and so draconian and totalitarian, legal and constitutional experts pointed out that it could have applied to a nurse on a union picket line, could have been construed as a terrorist under that bill. Now, what happened next shows you the supreme importance of having a sort of a lengthy parliamentary scrutiny process, which is what Albanese didn't allow in January, right? Because when that emerged, that this is what they were trying to do, organisations like us mobilised, and it went through. These things went through inquiries. There was a lot of scrutiny on it, and eventually the government was forced. It still passed, but only after the government revised the definition of terrorism to still be broad, but not quite as extreme as that, right? So they got their way there. The 2 other main bills of the 7 included a bill to ban terrorist organisations. And to show you how far we've come, Alex, where we've just banned in one day hate groups. People nowadays would think, well, of course you should ban terrorist organisations. No, this was extremely controversial back in 2002, not because of some academic discussion about should you ban terrorist organisations, but because people knew, hang on, when you write laws like this, there's often consequences, intended or unintended, that go far beyond what you say the law is for. Right. And so, hang on, we're talking about being able to ban groups. How do you define? So you've got and remember, with the original definition of terrorism, you got groups that if they fit the original definition of terrorism, this could have applied to anybody. Yeah. Right. So that was really concerning how that would play out. One of the definitions of terrorism that still applies today is acts that destabilize the financial system. Well, the Citizens Party, especially still today, but definitely in those days, we were warning. We could have been accused of destabilising the financial system because we were warning there was a financial crash coming.
Or not even that, Robbie. It's if people want to get cash out of the banks, they could argue that that's destabilising it. Yeah.
Yeah, last year there was a couple of days where the cash defence movement, which we're part of, organised these cash out days, right? Essentially, they're like a run on banks, except they're ATMs. But that could be construed in certain ways. So these things are, once you have them set in law, the powers that be have the ability to be quite arbitrary in the way they interpret them, and so you are honor bound to resist laws like this. So that was the other one. And the big one then, though, back in 2002, was the ASIO bill. Because what really shocked even the Parliament is that the ASIO bill in 2002 proposed to give policing powers to ASIO for the first time. ASIO is a secret intelligence organisation. Well, it's called the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, but like intelligence organisations around the world, it's a secret one. It's secret. You're not allowed to identify ASIO agents and stuff like that. And from its inception in 1950 or 1949 to 2003, it was purely just an intelligence gathering organisation. And if that intelligence uncovered evidence of crimes or potential crimes, ASIO acted on that by passing on the intelligence to civilian police, and the civilian police would act on the intelligence. Now, in a democracy, this is part of the separation of powers. You don't have a military police. I mean, you have a military police for the military, but you don't have a military police. You don't have a secret police that's for the government. You have an independent civilian police, and they require oversight of an independent judiciary to act. They need warrants that are granted by a judge. That's a long-standing principle in Australia, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, etc. That's a hallmark of democracy. And what this ASIO bill did was say, okay, we're going to give this secret intelligence organisation its own policing powers to be able to detain and coercively question, which means without the right to silence and without the right not to self-incriminate, by the way. So they take away your right to silence, and anything you say can become the basis of charges against you later. And these are all throwing out the traditional principles of protections of people. This questioning is not just of suspects, but of non-suspects. And the original bill wanted to apply to 16-year-olds, children as young as 16. And yeah, there was enormous concern at the time. Hang on, and then the experts said they're creating a secret police. If you give your secret intelligence organisation policing powers, what you have created is a secret police, and it was like crossing the Rubicon, and that did happen. But because our party was involved, and I'll give you just a quick, detour here about how our party works. So I'm in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, Alex, and if anyone knows Melbourne, our office is in Coburg, which is just north of Brunswick, and then Brunswick is just beside Fitzroy. And if you know that Brunswick Fitzroy area, that's like woke, hippie, socialist central, right? Good on them, bless their hearts. So the lefties, because Howard was in government, to their credit, they got quite concerned about this, and they called for a public meeting in Fitzroy. So I and another person from our office went along to the meeting. And there was only about 30 people there, all a bit long in the tooth. And they're all having this angst-ridden discussion about these laws. Oh, what can we do about it? And someone said, maybe we should call a politician. And then the question was, well, does anyone know a politician? Oh, yeah, I know this guy. And so the person running the meeting said, let me write these names on the board. So he starts writing one name. Anyone else know the politicians? Someone else would come up with some name, starts writing that name. And then they say, okay, who can call these guys? And someone said, I'll be able to call that one. And anyway, I got a bit frustrated with this after a while, and I jumped up and said, put the Citizens Party down for about 1,000 calls to every single politician in Parliament. Because if you're going to fight this, you've got to bloody fight this. We're fighting fascism, for crying out loud, right? And we went to war. And I tell you what, a lot of those people in that meeting were very prejudiced against our party. 7 or 8 years earlier, they'd been marching and protests against us, calling us Nazis, all kinds of things, totally baseless. Someone in that meeting called us Nazis, but we led the opposition. I tell you, we won a lot of the people in that meeting over because we showed them how to mobilise, and we set up a phone bank in our office. We already had one, but we made it larger. We brought in a lot of volunteers. We just hit the phones. We called our members. We called every other organisation we could find. We called unions. We called churches. We called. We reached out to the leadership of the Muslim community because they were getting absolutely hammered with all the post 9/11 hysteria, right, etc. And in 2002, we took out a full-page ad in the Australian newspaper in the headline, "End them, don't amend them," and we compared these laws. We weren't allowed to use the word fascist in the ad. The Australian wouldn't let us use it, so we called them draconian. But we compared these laws to Hitler's Notverordnung, which means the emergency decree, right? Hitler became a dictator democratically. This is the paradox of history. The Reichstag fire had burnt down, right? They probably said it. Hermann Goering's thugs probably said it. They blamed the communists, and he said, I need emergency powers to deal with this and protect these will only be temporary to protect the German people. And the Reichstag, which is the name of the parliament, passed him those powers, and the rest was history, right? Within months, he'd banned all political parties and become the dictatorship. I mean, so when we said after World War II, never again, it wasn't just things like the Holocaust, etc., that never again applied to. It was an understanding of what led up to that and giving that kind of power, right, which is what you're supposed to learn from. This is what's supposed to separate our countries from these countries. Yet we were repeating this. So this was a big mobilization, and we targeted, and they didn't like this, we targeted the Labor Party in the Senate because John Howard didn't have the balance of power. So it came down to the Labor Party. He needed the Labor Party's support or some independents to get this passed. And so we hammered him. We hammered the Labor Party. And I used to talk to John Faulkner, his office. John Faulkner was a senior Labor senator in those days, if you remember that name. And I tell you what, Alex, they were arseholes to me. They were absolute arseholes. They couldn't stand the fact that the Citizens Party kept calling them up and saying, where are you on this bill? And they kept saying, oh, we haven't got a position yet. We haven't got a position yet. Where are you on this bill? We haven't got a position yet. And we did this for months, right? And they treated, actually the guy in the office that I used to talk to, his name was Alex, and he treated me with utter, he took the calls, but man, did he sneer at me. He was just obnoxious. And then one day he called me, and his tune had changed like you wouldn't believe. He said, oh, what you guys have done is amazing. These calls are fantastic. You're really having an impact. He said, I think it'd be a good idea if you started calling the Liberals. And I'm laughing my head off inside, right? Thinking, no, mate, we're not going to take the pressure off you bastards one iota, right? Because it's not about the Liberals. It's about you're not going to get away with that. You're going to be the bloc. But what had happened was we'd shifted Labor's position. Simon Crean came out and described these powers as police state powers. I found that the last day of Parliament in 2002 was a 27-hour straight sitting. What normally happens, they wanted to get this ASIO bill through that day, right? What normally happens the last day each year is you'll have a bit of token stuff in Parliament, and then there'll be this little period where the leaders of both parties get up and talk, give each other Christmas greetings and say, oh yeah, we're political enemies, but we can be friends and whatever and respect each other. It's a little ritual they do in Parliament every year. None of that year. It was acrimonious. Howard was accusing Simon Crean of being soft on terrorism. Crean just came right back at him and said, no, mate, you're setting up a police state. He specifically objected to the fact these powers would have applied to children, right, which he said is totally inappropriate. And after 27 hours straight of sitting, Parliament didn't pass the powers. Now, I have a theory, Alex, that later on, well, people might remember a few years ago, Simon Crean died sort of suddenly in Europe while he was over there. And in the obituaries I found fascinating because they focused on the fact that the main thing that he was known for when he was leader of the Labor Party was opposition to the Iraq War, which at the time he was pilloried for, but of course history vindicated him. And he was especially pilloried because the global leader of Labor parties, Tony Blair, one of the most evil men in the world, had been the architect of that war, right? And Simon Crean, and my strong theory is that one of the and this fight over the ASIO bill put the Labor Party in the headspace of actually taking a stand on things. And then unfortunately, when Mark Latham took over from Simon Crean, the first thing they did was a deal and pass the ASIO bill. Still then, though, the debate, the final debate, was the second longest debate in parliamentary history, and it only passed because the government put a sunset clause on these powers, a 3-year sunset clause, to acknowledge they should be temporary. Now, that was quite dramatic. What has happened since then, what started off as 7 7 bills in 2002. The last time we counted before this latest round, it was a few years ago, was already over 100 bills in total that have gone through Parliament on terrorism. Now, these are bills that range from things like, if you remember, there was a famous David Spears one in Walkley in about 2015 because he interviewed George Brandis, the Attorney General, about surveillance powers and the government being able to spy on your phones and on your internet use, right? Bills, things like that. But also in relation to ASIO, and hardly anyone pays attention to this, also in 2015 under Tony Abbott, they passed a law that says journalists in Australia can be jailed for 10 years for reporting on an ASIO operation. 10 years. Now, later that year, I couldn't believe it. I just saw this the other day when I was brushing up on some of this stuff. I mean we sort of lived it, but you get back and look up details, etc. I found this article that said how a politician had mentioned in passing that journalists could be jailed for 10 years for reporting on an ASIO operation. And the ABC fact-checked him. And I was blown away by that. I'm thinking, you're the media. He's talking about something that affects you. You shouldn't have to fact-check him. That fact, because the fact-check confirmed he was right, that fact should be hung up in front of every journalist's desk saying, we have to get rid of this law, right? This is a fascist law that destroys press freedom in Australia, and you have to fact-check the politician who tells you about it. That politician happened to be Anthony Albanese. 10 years later, it's Albanese who's ramming home these fascist laws. I want to say something else about ASIO quickly before we get to this, because you might think, well, maybe there's some legitimacy to this idea of an ASIO operation. After the Lindt Cafe siege, which was December 2014, there was an interesting event where one of two Australians who had been at Guantanamo Bay, the lesser known one, not David Hicks, the white guy, the other guy was a Muslim. His name was Mamdouh Habib. So in Australia, we gave all the publicity to David Hicks, and poor old Mamdouh Habib, no one cared about him. But Mamdouh Habib eventually got out of Guantanamo Bay and came back to Australia. And he revealed, after that he knew the Lindt Cafe perpetrator, and that he had tried to get the police to allow him to negotiate with him, with Man Monis, the perpetrator, and the police, because he said he had a certain insight. So based on that, I got to know Mamdouh Habib quite well. I've got footage that he shared with me from 2010 and 2011. Because when he came back to Australia from Guantanamo Bay, Mamdouh Habib claimed that everyone knew he'd been tortured in Egypt. He had been rendered by the Americans to Egypt and he got tortured. And then he was sent to Guantanamo Bay. He claimed that ASIO was present when he was tortured in Egypt. And of course, this was all denied. In the 2010 interview, he used to have these periodically annual checkups with ASIO. I see the footage is they had to record these things, but you don't see the officer. The camera's behind him. You just see Mamdouh and his wife. And the ASIO officer is treating Mamdouh Habib like dirt, absolute dirt, treating him with utter contempt. A year later, it was a very different interview, because in the meantime, the government had changed in Egypt, and the new government released the records that showed, yes, Mamdouh Habib had been tortured in Egypt, and yes, an ASIO officer had been present when he was tortured in Egypt. In other words, our ASIO was complicit in the torture of an Australian citizen in a foreign country. And when I say torture, I don't mean waterboarding, which is still torture. Right? The Egyptians are not as squeamish as the Americans. I mean full torture. I mean electrocution and the whole works. He was absolutely brutally tortured. And there's, if you're familiar with the YouTube channel Boy, the couple of young guys in Sydney that do a really great YouTube channel, they did an interview on CIA torture with Mamdouh Habib a little while ago, and you can look it up and get his description of it. Right? Just look up the YouTube channel Boy, and you'll get it. And so when this ASIO officer was interviewing him, he was like, he was kissing his ass. And the quote that I wrote down in an article was ASIO to saying to Mamdouh Habib, you have every right to be mad and angry at your country, right? They gave him an $8 million payout, Alex, right? That was proven. This is an open and shut case. That's what ASIO did, this agency, that our government last month said, oh, they're the people that'll be the your protection with this law to ban groups, right?
Yeah.
So that's some of the history of this, and now we have a law which takes it much further.
Yeah, it's pretty wild stuff, isn't it? The other thing that I've been talking about that concerns me is that broad definition of domestic terrorist, right? And how it's heading. It's the new anti-Semitism laws, and as you say, you're not allowed to criticize the actions of Israel, which is like, they're trying to tie racism into political and then tied in with Zionism, and it's just all heading in this direction of any criticism of these intelligence agencies that are often compromised. There's a lot of concern about the political influence now of Israel with the donations and some of the blackmail bribery stuff coming out and all that. So that's my concern of all this direction that's heading in everything that's coming out. Are they going to make it illegal to criticize the government or point out facts?
Well, so I spoke to a just the other day, I spoke to a former top cop, and I mean top, who has also had extensive counter-terrorism experience. And in fact, because post 9/11, there were some examples of terrorism plots in Australia, right? And there was some terrorism attacks, of course. And he was involved in that. And so that I don't live in an ivory tower, I had my main question to him was, look, why the government said ASIO has to have these powers, and the government claimed the reason ASIO had to have these powers is under the scenario of a ticking time bomb, because the hysteria post 9/11, right, could it happen? Are we under attack all the time, kind of thing. I mean, Kim Beazley, in the middle of this debate, Kim Beazley, who didn't like the fact he wasn't leader of the opposition back in 2002, he gave this bloodthirsty speech about how the terrorists are trying to attack us on all sides and whatever. I mean, that was the feeling of the time. And I said, why does ASIO need these powers for questioning instead of the normal police force? Can't you do the questioning? He said, of course we can, right? And yeah, he had a certain theory about how, an ASIO has, because it's got ties to other intelligence organizations around the world, maybe they have to have something. But in terms of the practicalities of, if you want to combat an imminent terrorist threat and you need information, your own police force is capable of pulling someone in and asking them questions, right? But they have to get a warrant from a judge, right? But the judge doesn't want to be part of it, doesn't want a terrorist attack either. So, come on, these things are possible. But then he said, checks and balances are absolutely necessary. And one of his scenarios, there's a whole bunch of arguments for checks and balances, but one of his scenarios was, even if the government of the day is sincere, right? The reason we have these traditions in law is because you don't know what a future government might be like, right? And then they got a future government that wants to punish people, wants to suppress political opposition. They got all the suite of powers to do it. And that's where, just to come back to the ASIO question, that's why the bill now is so dangerous, because it does a couple of things. It turned out that as part of the 100 bills post 2002, there were some of those bills had already expanded ASIO's power. So just to be clear, ASIO can detain people for questioning, force them to answer questions, etc., and doesn't need a warrant from a judge. The warrant comes from the Attorney General. Now, that's already a breach of the separation of powers, because that means the government provides the government's bulldog, ASIO, with the authority, rather than the other branch of government have to provide the authority, right? That can be abused straight away, used against political enemies, that kind of thing. And as for young as 16. But before now, they'd already expanded ASIO's powers to reduce the age to 14. So it now applies to 14-year-olds olds can be detained. An ASIO officer can snatch a 14-year-old white girl off the street and question her without any protections. Right? That's what can happen now. The girl has the right to have a family member there. If an adult has the right to have a lawyer there, but ASIO has to approve the lawyer. And for the youth, the family member, they'll be in a sense kept incommunicado with no right to reveal what the conversations are about, etc. That's already the power now. In 2020, the government had already expanded the scope of questioning from terrorist attacks to things like espionage and foreign interference. Now, my argument about both of those is, yes, they are areas of ASIO's responsibility, but I can't emphasize enough, Alex, how the only reason they got this bill through in 2003 was because of this scenario that they brainwashed everyone with of the ticking time bomb. Mm-hmm. Come on, there's an imminent terrorist attack. ASIO's got to get its information. People have to answer questions, right? That justifies everything. Well, okay, but that scenario doesn't apply to espionage. It certainly doesn't apply to foreign interference. There's been a poor Chinese guy just spent a year in jail here in Melbourne, and his supposed act of foreign interference was donating money to a hospital, right? It doesn't apply to any of those, but it just shows you how desensitized by them we've become to all these laws, right? People have lost their sense of principles, legal principles and civil liberties. So the bill now will do that even more. They'll expand the scope of questioning even more to everything ASIO does, right? So this is now part of the course. ASIO could just grab people and make them answer questions, and there's no legal protections anymore for anything ASIO wants to do, to ask them about, anything. No, it doesn't have to apply to an imminent terrorist threat. So that's one thing. And the worst part is Tony Burke, and he said it's because ASIO asked. Tony Burke and Anthony Albanese, in their wisdom, have decided that this sunset clause that was originally put on, that's just kept being renewed every few years, there's no point having it anymore. These powers, they'll repeal the sunset clause. These powers will hereafter be permanent. Australia will have a permanent secret police. And there is a terrifying prospect for all the reasons we've just talked about.
100%. Not just that. I mean, look at what's going on in America now with all these the ICE agents, and there's no due process. And the other thing we've seen since Bondi was talk of a Jewish police or IDF soldiers, patrolling the streets in Australia. So you've got these intelligence agencies and the politicians and all this concern about them, kind of being compromised or answering to a foreign nation. And now you've got talk of this secret police and just all this subversion of due process.
Yeah, you feel exactly, and it's all done in the name of, the threat is so bad, the safety comes first. Well, here's a question for you, Alex. I've given you the description of what ASIO's powers are. Along with the powers that ASIO has been given since 2002, is enormous extra resources, and I mean enormous, right? They have. I don't know if you've been to Canberra lately, but they recently, a few years ago, they moved into their new headquarters. It is massive. Right, enormous extra resources. The current head of ASIO has become more well-known than most government ministers. ASIO for a long time was just there in the background, right? He now runs an annual circus called the Threat Assessment Speech, and he just dangles things to the media, right? And just to people have been commentating what a media whore this guy is, and he's becoming a power center in his own right. But they knew the perpetrators of the Bondi attack. Mm-hmm. Why weren't they able to stop this attack? That's why we gave them these powers. If they hadn't known the perpetrators, I might cut them a little bit of slack. But the fact they knew the perpetrators, they got all the powers in the world. What gives here, right? And I'm hoping. Well, we will be engaged in the Royal Commission, which has scope to dig into a little bit of that. Right, and we will be asking the questions to make sure that that's not brushed under the carpet.
Yeah. Oh, and I mean, I've already got friends saying that when they come back from overseas, from Bali, whatever, if you've been posting anti-government stuff, they've taken their phones and laptops and stuff, and yet they'll let someone in like that who's just been to an area where people are radicalised and they're on the ASIO watch list and own 6 guns, and you're right to come back in, but if you've been posting anti-government stuff, we're going to treat you like a thug and take your devices off you.
By the way, I have a theory. I have a theory about the now this may prove to be completely wrong. So if people are still watching the video at this point and you discover in the future I'm wrong, understand that I'm just saying it's a theory. But we're told that when this father and son duo went to southern Philippines, right, Mindanao, a known terrorist training hotspot, they never left the hotel room. Well, I'm actually in the middle of reading a book about ISIS and the Australian soldiers who were over in the Middle East at the time of ISIS and involved in the fight against ISIS, such as it was. They reveal something in there about the fact that how closely terrorists were monitored and their locations in the Middle East. The people who'd left Australia to go over there, because that was a bit of a phenomenon. People from all around the world went to the Middle East and joined ISIS. But the Australian intelligence agencies who were tracking them, they were tracking them on their phones. And when they abandoned their phones, they couldn't track them anymore. So my theory is these guys probably just left their phones in their hotel room. Because that's why you spend 20 days in a hotel room, because who does that? Seriously, Jesus, give me a break, right? They probably just left their phones in the hotel room. We're getting this cover story about how the hotel staff say that. Because if my theory is right, it means ASIO was tracking him all along. But anyway, that's just a theory.
Right? I mean, it's just like weapons of mass destruction, Robbie. It's just all lies, I think, from these intelligence agencies to push the narrative along.
Look, it's a real problem. I think the existence of intelligence agencies is the original sin. When MI5 came to Australia in 1949 and said to Ben Chifley, "We want you to set up a branch of MI5 here," he initially refused. He said, "We don't want it." He actually supported a secret police. He said, "We don't want one," because the intelligence function can be. The military has an intelligence arm. The police have an intelligence arm. They can do that in a proper way, right? A dedicated intelligence agency where what you're doing is you're creating an apparatus that starts to sit above government and then increasingly out of the control of government. And that's what it's become and the British set this up actually, not the CIA is definitely involved, don't get me wrong, but it was the British were the architects of this. And what's called Five Eyes is this thing now. I can tell you the way Australian politicians think. If Mike Burgess makes some claim and they say, "Well, give us the evidence of that," all he has to say is, "Sorry, I can't," because that's from our fellow intelligence agencies in Five Eyes. Every single Australian politician is so subservient to this system now, they'll just shut up and not question it.
And that's what we saw last year with some of the anti-Semitic attacks, where all the police and all the investigations showed that, no, this is all staged or fake or a hoax. And then ASIO go, "Oh, we got a tip from Israeli intelligence, but we can't say what it is."
And on the basis of that, they kicked out the Iranian ambassador. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, straight after Bondi, the first politicians on the screens were Israelis, right? Benjamin Netanyahu and Naftali Bennett, etc., commenting about an event in Australia. And Netanyahu said, "This must be Iran," right? But then as soon as they identified the guys, they're the enemies of Iran, right? They're ISIS affiliated. The enemies of Iran. So this whole Iran narrative that ASIO perpetrated has no credibility whatsoever, but no one will question it.
Yeah.
Can I just say, so I've laid out a lot there. The Citizens Party's put up a petition that's on our website now. We just launched it yesterday to repeal, don't expand these ASIO powers. We're backed, like that call is backed by people like the Law Council of Australia, right? Constitutional experts have been saying it for 20 years, these should be repealed, right? We're trying to give people an insight into when we used to have legal standards in this country, and there are still people in the legal fraternity there. So it's a sound position that we're calling for. We're not calling for Australia to be defenseless against terrorism because, as I said, the police have the power to do this stuff themselves, and they at least have checks and balances. That's the way it should be done. But do we want to have a police state? Do we want to have a secret police? And if we don't, sign the petition. And we also want people to write letters to the committee that's looking at the bill and call your senators and members of parliament and say, do not support this bill, because I think we can pick a real fight in parliament over this and educate politicians as well as the general public while we're at it, Alex.
Yeah. Well, I know you got to go soon, Robbie, so I'll put the links to the petition and all your socials down below. And thanks so much for your time. I hope you guys have enjoyed that one at home. Cheers, mate.
Thanks, Alex.